Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2008, Bloomberg News had to file a lawsuit to force the Federal Reserve to respond to a request to reveal the identities of the firms for which it had provided guarantees during the late 2000s during the financial crisis. Nearly 3 years later, and after considerable expense to the taxpayer and use of our court system, the Federal Reserve finally relented and disclosed those names. Should the Freedom of Information Act be updated to clarify unambiguously that the Federal Reserve is subject to FOIA? And anybody's welcome to respond to that.
Yes, I agree. And I think that there are other loopholes. Of course, Congress is not subject to FOIA either.
Mr. Harper?
Yes, the Fed should be subject to FOIA. I'll reserve whether Congress should be subject to FOIA because it's so very different from the federal executive branch.
Mr. Schuman?
I would just say that we also see, whether it's the Fed generally or with specific aspects of legislation, there are oftentimes riders that are put into bills that work their way through Congress that create exemptions to FOIA. And we see this with spending by entities like the Fed, or we see this with other national security, or with matters that are entirely unrelated to sensitive issues whatsoever. And we believe, and I think others do as well, that these attempts to amend, to create loopholes in FOIA are often too large or not appropriately vetted. And we think this is another issue that should go through regular channels within Congress to make sure these loopholes aren't put in a way that is either unintentionally large or defeats the purpose of FOIA.
Ms. Wexler?
Yes, and I think that there are enough exemptions now in current FOIA law that I don't think we'd have to worry about inadvertently disclosing through the Federal Reserve something that really legitimately should not be disclosed.
So pursuing those sort of loopholes and exemptions, I'm concerned, is there enough visibility into federal money after it gets, for instance, block granted to the states, or when Congress otherwise passes federal dollars to municipalities or even private organizations to spend that money? Do we have enough track of how that money is being spent, for instance, on agricultural subsidies or subsidies for insurance? Mr. Schuman?
The short answer is no. When you look at the data that is reported to the public, as our Clear Spending Report has found, it is unreliable. When you look at the new reporting that was required under the Recovery Act, what we found is it actually prompted states and localities to create transparency measures that they never had before. They started thinking about these issues in different kinds of ways, and they actually became more open and accountable. But as things exist now, while some states do a good job, some states do a bad job, as a general rule, you really can't follow the money all the way down. You can't see where it comes from, which is what Jim was talking about before in terms of how money goes through the legislative process and the appropriations and the obligation process. But you can't see it all the way to the end. That's why you need subrecipient and subgrantee reporting, which is some of the provisions that the Data Act contains.
Mr. Harper?
I agree that there is enough transparency in ultimate recipient.
Is or is not?
Is not enough transparency in ultimate recipient information. You want to be able to see all the way through the process: agency, bureau, program, project, the obligation, grant, the outlay, the recipient, the subrecipient. Just to be clear or head off a concern people may have, you don't want to invade privacy. That is, if it's a benefits program, we're not talking about publishing the names of people who get Social Security checks or other public benefits. But when it comes to corporate entities or organizational units that receive outlays of federal funds, ultimately, we want that data.
That's a good lead into my final question. Without violating privacy concerns, is there a role for more sunlight and disclosure for disclosing SSI and disability fraud, which we all know exists, but it's hard to get our hands around? Is there a role, is there a way to expose some of that fraud without disclosing personal data? Mr. Harper?
I would say that you don't want to give transparency to personal information of recipients of SSI disability. The way you'd probably want to do it is through data mining. There are probably common forms of fraud on these systems, and once you learn to recognize those frauds in your data, you can look for them happening again. Credit cards do this. When somebody spends $5 at the gas station and $5,000 at the Best Buy, that's them testing a credit card to see if it's still live so they can go buy electronics. That kind of pattern is a thing you might be able to see in SSI data.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back.